Gendry had always known there was something different about him. Growing up in the slums of King's Landing, he could never put his finger on it. He just had an instinct, an unvoiced certainty, that his blood ran hotter and prouder than the streets he worked in every day. As he labored in the smithy, soot covering his arms and chest, he felt strength in every swing of the hammer that surpassed that of other apprentices. He had broad shoulders, a strong back, and a pair of startling blue eyes that seemed out of place for a common-born boy. Yet he wore his bastard's life like a cloak he never thought to shrug off. That was simply who he was, Gendry, the blacksmith's apprentice. But the day King Robert Baratheon died changed everything. The hush that spread through King's Landing was as chilly as a north wind. Word circulated with speed only rumors can muster. The king had not returned from his boar hunt in one piece. He was mortally wounded and drew his final breaths in the Red Keep. There was talk of how Ser Barristan Selmy had guarded him, of how Queen Cersei hovered close, of the drama unfolding between the king's hand, Lord Eddard Stark, and the Lannister brood. Yet most small folk didn't know the details. They only knew a king was dead, or as good as dead, and no one was quite sure what chaos would follow. Gendry found himself visited that day by a man most unexpected. Lord Eddard Stark himself. That, in and of itself, had been a shock. The hand of the king had come to the smithy weeks before, quietly investigating Robert's bastards. Though Gendry himself suspected nothing of the reason, he remembered the man's gray eyes appraising him, remembered how Lord Stark had asked if his mother had golden hair or dark. Gendry had given simple answers, never imagining the weight they held. On that day of the king's death, Lord Stark arrived in the smithy silently, pulling off the hood of his cloak to reveal grave concern etched into every line on his face. The men in the workshop turned their heads in awe, and even Tobo Mott, Gendry's master, seemed unsure whether to kneel or not. But the urgency in the Lord's eyes ended any hesitation. Mott inclined his head with respect while the apprentices stood aside. Gendry was called to speak with him again. This time, Lord Stark brought dire news. King Robert was dying, and Gendry's life was in danger. It was Lord Stark who told him the truth, there in the dim glow of the forge and the hiss of hot coals. He explained that Gendry was the king's bastard son, a fact that could be used against him in the vicious scramble for power about to descend on the realm. Gendry's hammer nearly fell from his grip. He didn't believe it at first, he couldn't. Yet the sense of his own difference, those blue eyes, the powerful build, every jesting rumor he'd heard about how he didn't resemble his peers, suddenly fit together like a puzzle. It seemed monstrous, impossible, and yet it made perfect sense. What else could explain it? Lord Stark's intention had been to whisk Gendry away, to protect him from the knives sure to come for King Robert's bastards, or for any threat to the boy who was about to become King Joffrey. Yet in that moment, as thunder rumbled distantly over King's Landing, something else happened. Word reached them, quiet at first, then growing into a roar like an approaching storm, that many of the king's own bannermen were stirring in the city. Soldiers bearing the Black Stag on a field of gold were closing ranks, arriving from the Stormlands for what they believed would be their final chance to pay homage to Robert. With Robert on his deathbed and rumors of conspiracy swirling, the Stormlords had no clear figure to rally around. Stannis was away in Dragonstone, moody and unliked by many. Renly, who had quickly made his own moves, was seen as charming but too green for some of the more seasoned knights. The Lannisters were inside the Red Keep, poised to snatch the throne for Joffrey. Gendry had never considered himself a leader, let alone a prince. But some of the Stormlords, disillusioned by Lannister control and by the uncertain claims of Stannis and Renly, began to whisper about an unacknowledged heir who had the blood of Robert Baratheon in his veins. A boy, yes, but a boy with the Baratheon look so reminiscent of a young Robert. And there were those among them who remembered how Robert had been in his youth. Strong, charismatic, a man who inspired loyalty with a mere glance. Some men believed that if this bastard had inherited even a fraction of that presence, he might rally them to a cause that felt more honest than the sly plotting of courtiers. Lords like Bryce Cairn of Nightsong, the Tarths, the Selmys of Harvest Hall, even men of lesser houses, felt the weight of a choice that would define the future of the Seven Kingdoms. In a time when the throne was up for the taking, they saw in Gendry a chance to reassert Baratheon's strength. Gendry, for his part, stood with his hammer still warm in his hands, soot staining his cheeks, as he listened to Lord Stark warn him that men might try to use him. Lord Stark believed the best course was to hide Gendry away, to keep him from Cersei's knowledge at all cost. But in a twist of fate, a messenger arrived at that very moment, summoning Lord Stark urgently to the Red Keep. The king had taken a final turn for the worse, and Cersei was moving swiftly, possibly preparing for the transition of power to Joffrey. With pain evident in his eyes, Lord Stark had to leave Gendry behind. He pressed a coin into Gendry's palm, told him to stay put, and promised to return. But as the day went on, Lord Stark was not seen again. Night fell. The city churned in tense anticipation. Soldiers loyal to House Baratheon, remnants of Robert's men who had come to King's Landing for various reasons, were gathering in pockets, uncertain whom to serve now. Rumors spread about the king's last will, about Cersei's possible meddling, about Ned Stark's secret knowledge, about the newly crowned King Joffrey. No one was sure of the truth, but everyone felt the weight of a powder keg waiting to explode. Tension was so thick that even Gendry, holed up in the smithy, heard the talk from passing guardsmen or small folk scurrying through the streets. The king had died. Everyone was sure of it now, though the announcement might not have been made official. Sometime in the dead of night, Robert Baratheon had gone to his grave. The city would never be the same. Gendry was used to forging steel, not forging destinies, and the idea that he was the king's son weighed on him like a boulder. But no more than an hour after midnight, a small contingent of armed men came to the smithy. Their tabards bore the crowned stag of House Baratheon, and their voices carried an authority that made Master Mott quake. These were not gold cloaks under the command of the city watch. These were Stormland knights, come to find the boy rumored to carry the king's blood. When they laid eyes on Gendry, they recognized him on sight. Black hair curling around his ears, bright blue eyes, the strength in his frame. And Gendry saw in their faces that they wanted something from him. He was whisked away that night, no chance to gather his meager belongings. It wasn't a violent abduction. They told him he was needed, that fate itself demanded his presence. He was hustled into a waiting cart and taken through winding alleys to a hidden courtyard behind a tall estate. Dimly lit by torches, a small group of Stormlords awaited him, men of proud houses who kneeled to no one but House Baratheon. In hushed voices, they laid it all out. King Robert was dead, and Gendry was his only child in King's Landing who could represent the Baratheon bloodline in the immediate chaos. Stannis was far away, slow to move, reluctant to treat with men he found lesser. Renly was rumored to be scheming a coup, appealing to the Tyrells, hoping to marry Margaery Tyrell and secure their support. The Lannisters were already inside the Red Keep, ready to crown Joffrey. But in Gendry, the spitting image of a young Robert, a boy who had lived among the small folk, some of these lords saw a possibility. Gendry wasn't sure what any of it meant. He mumbled half-formed protests, uncertain if he even wanted this monstrous responsibility. Yet there was something stirring in him, a sense of injustice at the talk of Joffrey, Cersei's golden-haired child, taking the throne of Robert Baratheon, a father Gendry had never met. They explained that if Gendry was willing to stand before them, to declare himself Robert's trueborn, well, not truly trueborn, but rightful by virtue of the king's recognized blood, he might spark a movement that would rally the Stormlands. Many of the knights believed the small folk would rally behind the memory of Robert, spurred by the living image of him in Gendry's form. It was madness. Gendry was unlettered in matters of politics and war, but he was no fool. He knew the power that the Lannisters held. To oppose them meant bloodshed, and even if he survived, he had no illusions he would ever be truly safe. Yet as these men spoke passionately of the honor of House Baratheon, of their devotion to Robert's rightful line, Gendry felt a warmth in his chest he couldn't quite explain. Was it pride? A glimmer of defiance? Was it the memory of forging steel, the same sense of creation, only now he might forge something new in the city's future? They didn't give him much time. Dawn would break soon, and the city was on the cusp of an explosion. Finally, when one of the older knights, Sir John Penrose, placed a hand on Gendry's shoulder, the boy felt the rough gauntlet and the trembling beneath it. Sir John told him, voice heavy, that to do nothing would mean the complete victory of the Lannisters, and the betrayal of everything Robert had fought for in the rebellion against the Targaryens. Sir John believed that if the rightful Baratheon blood wasn't recognized now, the realm would be lost to Lannister greed forever. Gendry took a deep breath, the weight of 1,000 oaths pressing in on him. He was frightened, but he was also moved. At last he said yes, he would stand up, though he had no idea what that truly meant. The knights hooped softly in triumph, as if their hearts had been in their throats, waiting for him to refuse. They clasped his hands, bent their knees for a moment in respect, then began to plan in earnest. The plan was audacious. Seize King's Landing in the chaos of Robert's death before the Lannisters could secure their hold. The Stormlords still had men in the city, and they were calling up more from the Stormlands. King's Landing's watch might be bribed or turned if approached carefully. Many of them had also served Robert faithfully, and Gendry, the living banner of House Baratheon, would ride at their head when they confronted the people. Any who questioned his parentage would look into his eyes, see the shape of his jaw, the color of his hair, and they would remember Robert. That was the gamble, at least. With enough of a show of strength, they could lock down the city, isolate the Red Keep, and demand the crown for Gendry, or at least topple Cersei's immediate claim on Joffrey's behalf. Renly might fold if faced with a direct competitor with a more obvious Baratheon look. Stannis might rage, but he was far away and had never been loved by the Stormlands as Robert had been. Gendry was reeling when they told him he would need to learn how to speak like a highborn, how to stand so that soldiers saw a leader instead of a blacksmith's apprentice. He couldn't fathom the idea of giving a speech to crowds or standing at the front of an army. He felt entirely unprepared. But the knights were unwavering in their belief, or at least they hid their doubts well. By the time dawn tinted the sky with pink and gold, they had ironed out the broad strokes. Gendry would appear among the Stormlords at first light outside the city gates, where many of their men camped, and reveal himself. The news that Robert's bastard was stepping forward to challenge the Lannisters would spread like wildfire. Then they would take advantage of the confusion to move in force upon the city, using the gates that might still be manned by Baratheon-sympathetic soldiers. Then onto the Red Keep. The sun rose, lighting King's Landing with a pale glow that seemed ill-fitting for the darkness that brewed beneath. Gendry, dressed in hastily borrowed finery, ill-fitting boots, a cloak that smelled of dust, rode on a tall warhorse he could barely command. Around him, knights in Baratheon livery escorted him, and as they passed through the cobbled streets, people turned to stare. Rumors spread within minutes. By the time they reached the Gate of the Gods, a loose crowd had formed. Soldiers parted for them, uncertain but compelled by the presence of these Stormlords and by the sight of Gendry's face. Some recognized him as the smith's apprentice and gawked, but just as many were struck by his resemblance to the late king. The hush in the crowd was almost tangible. Gendry's heart hammered in his chest. Then, with the help of a herald who bellowed in a carrying voice, Gendry was introduced to those present as Gendry Waters, the son of Robert Baratheon, rightful heir to the Iron Throne. Gendry swallowed hard, feeling an urge to flee, to hide in the nearest forge. But he forced himself to straighten his back, to grip the reins more confidently than he felt. In a trembling voice, he gave the speech the knights had helped him prepare, calling upon the memory of King Robert, the man who had saved the realm from the Mad King's tyranny. Gendry promised protection for the small folk, invoked the name Baratheon with as much boldness as he could muster, and demanded that the Lannisters stand aside. The reaction from the crowd was not uniform. Some jeered, some roared with excitement, some cried out in shock. But more and more, onlookers pressed forward to see his face, and many began to murmur that he truly did look like Robert. The Stormland Bannermen, gathered in greater numbers than anyone realized, raised their swords and shouted a war cry for House Baratheon. Before Gendry could fully comprehend it, a wave of people poured behind him, some of them small folk with clubs and pitchforks, some men-at-arms who had served Robert's reign. The gold cloaks at the gate hesitated. Their captain, a burly man with scars on his cheeks, looked Gendry in the eye, then slowly lowered his spear and knelt. That was the tipping point. With a new, thunderous cry, the Stormlords led the charge back into the city. King's Landing erupted. Word spread through the streets that Robert's bastard had arrived with an army, that the Lannisters were about to be thrown out, that a new Baratheon king was coming to take the throne. Confusion reigned, but in confusion there is also opportunity. Loyalists to House Lannister rushed to defend the Red Keep. In many places, the city watch was divided. Some men tore the gold cloaks from their shoulders and retreated, not wishing to be on the losing side. Others stood firm in Joffrey's name, resulting in pockets of vicious street fighting. Civilians screamed and ran for cover, while those bold or foolish enough to pick sides took to brawling. Through all of this, Gendry rode with the Stormlords around him, his heart hammering so loudly he could barely hear the clamor. He was still half-dazed, but he kept hearing the roars of men who recognized him as Robert's son, and it fueled his adrenaline. The plan was to capture the Red Keep before the Lannisters could fully fortify it, banking on the element of surprise and internal strife. As they approached the main gate of the Red Keep, Gendry's group met the first serious resistance. Rows of Lannister guards in shining armor formed a shield wall, crossbowmen posted atop the battlements. For a terrifying moment, Gendry thought they would all be cut down like sheep, that this insane plan would end in a hail of bolts. But a roar rose from his own men as a pair of Stormlords who had once fought beside Robert at the Trident led the charge. They hammered into the Lannister line with a fury reminiscent of Robert's younger days, and Gendry, summoning courage he never knew he had, dismounted and joined the fray. He found a discarded shield with the crowned stag on it, strapped it to his arm, and swung his blacksmith's hammer like the weapon it was always meant to be. Sparks flew as steel clashed on steel. Blood splattered across the courtyard. The Lannisters fought back fiercely, but the Stormlords, spurred by devotion to Robert and enthralled by the sight of a new Baratheon leading them, fought with unrelenting vigor. Inside the Red Keep, chaos reigned. Cersei Lannister had retreated into her chambers with Joffrey, who was still reeling from the news of Robert's death. The Boy King was unsure how to command, uncertain whether to order the massacre of the invaders or to attempt negotiations. Queen Cersei's ambition and fury burned. She demanded that they fortify Maegor's Holdfast, protect the king at all costs. Meanwhile, the Hound, Sandor Clegane, stood guard, uncertain whether to stay by the Lannisters or to recall his own sense of loyalty to the late King Robert's memory. Through corridors and stairwells, Lannister men scrambled to mount a defense. The Stormlords pushed inward. Gendry, breath-ragged, hammered down one last Lannister guard outside the main entrance. His arms shook with exertion, but the adrenaline pulsing through his veins gave him newfound stamina. He saw knights of House Cairn to his left, men of House Penrose to his right. Ser John Penrose was wounded, but he pressed on, urging Gendry forward. They barreled into the Red Keep's main hall with fierce determination. Courtiers shrieked and scattered. Some recognized the crowned stag on Gendry's shield and gasped at the face that might have been King Robert resurrected in younger form. Then came the moment that would define the coup. The great hall was filled with echoes of footsteps and shouts. Lannister guards rushed in from side entrances, forming a ring around the dais. For an instant, it seemed the two sides would tear each other apart in a frenzied melee. But in that heart-stopping moment, Gendry stepped forward, chest heaving, eyes blazing with an anger that was just as much confusion and heartbreak. He bellowed that the throne belonged to the blood of Robert Baratheon, and he demanded that they yield. The Lannister guards hesitated. Many of them had been Robert's men before the Queen had replaced them with her own. They saw the boy's face, recognized the hammer in his hand, so reminiscent of Robert's warhammer from days long past. Some men lowered their weapons or glanced nervously at each other. It wasn't over yet. Cersei arrived then, flanked by a small retinue of Lannister soldiers. Joffrey was beside her, trembling with rage and fear, crown askew on his golden head. With a shrill cry, the Queen commanded the guards to kill the pretender. But confusion reigned. Whispers started among the ranks. that Joffrey was not Robert's true son, that he was born of incest between the Queen and Ser Jaime Lannister. Men who had previously not believed it now saw Gendry in the flesh and remembered the rumors that the Baratheon children by Cersei all had golden hair, while every known Baratheon descendant had black hair. The cracks of doubt widened into open rebellion. More than a few men threw down their swords, unwilling to die for the Queen's lie. Still, the most loyal Lannister guards prepared to fight to the death. But they were outnumbered, and the Stormlords pushed closer. Steel rasped on steel, footsteps shuffled, the tension so thick it was nearly suffocating. Queen Cersei's eyes locked on Gendry's, a low bouquet of utter disdain and contempt shining there. She sneered at him, calling him a filthy bastard. Joffrey, for his part, screamed in a thin voice for someone to kill that peasant. But no one moved. The ring of Lannister soldiers parted as the Stormlords advanced, forming a barrier. Gendry found himself only a dozen paces from the Queen and her son. His lungs burned. His arm ached from the weight of the warhammer. His heart pounded like a blacksmith's drum. He did not know the proper kingly words to say. He did not know how to handle a queen or a prince. But he knew one thing. If he faltered now, everything would collapse. So he steadied himself, raised his hammer, and demanded Cersei yield in the name of Robert Baratheon's legacy. She spat at the floor, refusing to bow to a bastard. Joffrey, shrieking in frustration, tugged at her sleeve like a petulant child. In that moment, a surprising figure emerged from behind a column. Lord Varys, shuffling forward with his hands folded, face grave. The Master of Whisperers had watched from the shadows, as was his way, weighing which side to support. He had listened to the city's mood. Now, seeing that the Lannisters were on the brink of being overrun, he stepped forward and addressed Gendry as "My Lord Baratheon." Bowing slightly, he spoke with careful humility, saying that the people were on the verge of chaos, that violence would only lead to ruin. He cast a pointed glance at Cersei and Joffrey. In that weighted silence, Varys subtly indicated that the realm's stability was best served by Gendry taking control, lest the city burn in a protracted war. Some of the Lannisters hissed at the spider's betrayal, but Varys merely lowered his eyes, proclaiming that he served the realm and that the realm could see that Gendry had the stronger Baratheon claim. At those words, some of the more uncertain Lannister men set down their swords. Several knights who had followed Ser Jaime Lannister but now saw the writing on the wall also stepped aside. The Queen stood alone with only a few sworn swords left to protect her. The Stormlords advanced. A hush fell, broken only by Cersei's ragged breathing and Joffrey's whimpering. Then, with a furious shriek, the Queen grabbed a dagger from a guard's belt and tried to lunge at Gendry. She was stopped by two of Gendry's knights, who wrested the blade away and pinned her arms. Another seized Joffrey by the collar, ignoring the boy's flailing. The Red Keep's hall was silent except for the panting of exhausted men. Gendry, reeling at what he had just witnessed, saw the raw hatred in Cersei's face, the terror in Joffrey's eyes. He felt no triumph, only numbness. He was no king, no highborn, yet he had just seized King's Landing with an army. His men turned to him for instruction, and he realized they expected him to decide the Queen's fate, the new king's fate. He was at the center of a maelstrom he never asked for, but he was in it now, and there was no turning back. He looked around for Ned Stark, for anyone who might guide him, but the only man near was Varys, whose ambiguous expression revealed neither pleasure nor fear. Gendry took a shaky breath, lowered his hammer, and declared that Queen Cersei and Joffrey would be held under guard until the truth of their parentage and the circumstances of Robert's death could be judged. He turned to the kneeling men, hearing the echo of his own voice in the vaulted hall, and said that he would not spill more blood than necessary. For a moment, no one moved, stunned that a bastard-turned king might show mercy. Then one of the Stormlords bellowed an approval. Another joined in. Swords banged against shields in a clatter that reverberated up the tall stone pillars. The city was theirs, at least for now. The Red Keep's guards either laid down their arms or were subdued. Maegor's holdfast was secured. The gold cloaks that remained loyal to the crown were convinced to lay down their arms when they saw the Stormlords controlling every gate. The day stretched on in a haze of tension, but by nightfall, King's Landing streets were patrolled by knights wearing the stag sigil, accompanied by city watchmen who had bent the knee to this new power. All throughout the city, the small folk whispered the same name, Gendry Baratheon, the bastard who might be king. Gendry himself felt like he'd stepped into a waking dream. He was hurried from corridor to corridor, introduced to the labyrinth of the Red Keep. The Stormlords installed him in the king's chambers, clearing away anything that might remind him of the Lannisters. He sat on a featherbed that felt foreign under his exhausted body. He had never in his life experienced such luxury, and it made his skin crawl. All he wanted was to collapse onto some hay in a stable or a corner of the forge. But there was no time for rest. Knights and lords demanded audience with him, offering loyalty or seeking favors. Servants scurried about, terrified of displeasing this new occupant. At one point, Gendry found himself glaring at the mirrored reflection in a polished metal plate. Seeing the soot-stained boy, he still felt he was, and wondered how in the seven hells he had come to this. In the following days, Gendry discovered that taking a city and keeping it were two different beasts. The Lannisters still held the formidable fortress of Casterly Rock in the west. Tywin Lannister was rumored to be marching with an army. The Tyrells in the Reach had not declared for anyone yet, but they might side with Renly, who had vanished from the capital. Stannis on Dragonstone would certainly claim the Iron Throne himself. As a recognized Baratheon, Gendry now found himself standing in the crosshairs of every power in Westeros. And the city he had won was not wholly stable. Bread was running short. The war had disrupted trade routes. The small folk needed reassurance that their new ruler would protect them from looming famine. And, of course, the question of Cersei and Joffrey loomed large. Lord Varys hovered near Gendry, dispensing subtle counsel. The eunuch recommended that Gendry treat with the Grand Maester, Pycelle, though Pycelle had been firmly in the Lannisters' pocket. Varys also hinted that Gendry should secure the loyalty of Peter Baelish, the Master of Coin, but Gendry found Littlefinger's sly smile unsettling. Still, Gendry had no one else to turn to. Lord Stark was nowhere to be found. Rumors whispered that he had been arrested, or that he had escaped the Red Keep before the fighting broke out. In truth, no one knew. Gendry silently prayed the man was alive, for he felt that Lord Stark was the only one he could trust. As it stood, he had to glean counsel from men he barely knew, all of whom likely had their own agendas. Meanwhile, the Stormlords who had rallied to Gendry's cause urged him to formalize his claim by crowning himself. They believed that if the crown was placed on his head, some of the fence-sitters might commit to him fully. Others suggested he legitimize himself as a Baratheon by royal decree, though ironically, to do so, he needed the authority of the king, which was now supposed to be him. The paradox made Gendry's head spin. At length, the Stormlords gathered in the throne room. The Iron Throne rose in its spiked glory at the front. That monstrous seat of melted swords loomed like a predator, ready to consume anyone who tried to claim it. Gendry's stomach knotted at the sight of it, for he'd only heard stories. How men had cut themselves to ribbons sitting upon it, how Aerys the Mad King had cackled on it, how Robert, his father, had once slouched there in boredom at the tedious business of being a king. Now it was Gendry's turn. He wore no crown, only a black cloak embroidered with a gold stag pin. His hammer hung at his belt, for he had no sword. Felt more natural, more honest. The hall was thick with tension as stormborn knights and lords lined both sides of the aisle. At the far end, near the dais, a bruised Ser Meryn Trant stood guard over Cersei and Joffrey, their hands bound. The queen glared with open hatred, but Joffrey's eyes darted around like a cornered animal. Ser Jon Penrose stepped forward, bandaged from the fight but determined. In a ceremonial tone, he proclaimed that Robert Baratheon's rightful child, Gendry Waters, had come forth to assume the throne and protect the realm from false claimants. At the mention of false claimants, Cersei let out a scornful laugh, and Joffrey snarled something under his breath. But no one paid them heed. With a heavy expression, Ser Jon beckoned Gendry to ascend the steps and seat himself on the Iron Throne. Gendry felt every eye on him, felt their expectations and their hopes. He swallowed, tasting bile. Then, with measured steps, he climbed the dais. Each footfall echoed. When he stood before the throne, he hesitated. The metal swords jutted out cruelly, a monument to power gained through violence. In that instant, Gendry realized the weight of what lay ahead. This was no mere blacksmith's bench. This seat had consumed the lives of men far more cunning and ruthless than he. But he was Robert's son, and if these lords believed in him, perhaps he could be something greater. He slowly sat. The metal was cold, unyielding. The edges pricked at him. He tried not to flinch. He saw the entire throne room from a new vantage, saw the men and women kneeling or standing in apprehension. He tried to imagine how Robert had felt the first time he'd taken this seat. Pride? Weariness? Triumph? Gendry felt only the hammering of his heart. Then Ser Jon, hobbling slightly, lifted a battered crown, Robert's crown, recovered from the royal chambers, and placed it on Gendry's head. The metal felt too large, threatening to slip down his brow, but it somehow stayed. A hush fell over the hall. Then, with a collective exhalation, the Storm Lords knelt and cried, "Long live King Gendry! Long live the Baratheon king!" It echoed, magnified by the stone walls. Gendry felt lightheaded, as if the entire world were spinning. He tried to keep his composure, to recall the phrases they drilled into him, to speak of justice and duty, to pledge to uphold Robert's legacy, to swear to protect the realm. The words came out haltingly, but the lords and knights clapped and cheered all the same. This was a moment none of them had expected. The bastard forging a new destiny atop the Iron Throne itself. With the crowd in rapture, Ser Jon Penrose next called for the fate of the prisoner queen and her son. The hall fell silent as men turned their eyes to Gendry. Cersei, trembling with a mixture of wrath and dread, clenched her jaw. Joffrey stood at her side, tears of rage gathering in his eyes. Gendry took a moment before he spoke, for he had no desire to appear cruel or weak. He recalled how swiftly Robert had dealt with traitors in stories. But Gendry was not Robert. He needed to show that he was not just another tyrant. He declared that Cersei and Joffrey would remain imprisoned until a proper trial could be convened to investigate the allegations of incest, treason, and the murder of King Robert. He stated that justice must be served properly, not by a snap of the fingers. Some knights looked uneasy, wanting a harsher measure. But Gendry repeated that the realm must see justice done in the light of day, not in the shadows. Varys, from his place near a pillar, offered a subtle, approving nod. The queen, glaring, spat an epithet, but she was dragged away before she could hurl further abuse. Joffrey, screaming that he was the king, was also hauled off, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. Thus began Gendry's reign, if it could be called that. For in the days that followed, the fledgling king discovered that a city seized by force is a city in turmoil. The small folk were uncertain if they'd merely swapped one set of overlords for another. The great houses watched like hawks, uncertain how to respond. Raventree Hall, Riverrun, the Vale, Dorne, the North. None knew what to make of a bastard on the Iron Throne. Would the realm accept it? Would they turn to Renly or Stannis? Or would they demand Gendry prove himself by some show of force? The Storm Lords pressed Gendry to send out ravens, proclaiming his new reign. Gendry obeyed, though he felt a pang of fear each time he signed a letter as Gendry of the House Baratheon, first of his name, King of the Undulls and the First Men. Felt like a lie, a costume, but the Storm Lords reminded him that kingship was a role one had to fill, not a comfortable mantle one slipped on by birth alone. If Robert had seized the throne after a rebellion, why couldn't Gendry do the same? At first, there was little response. But then ravens began arriving in turn. Lord Tywin Lannister threatened war, demanding the immediate release of his daughter and grandson. Stannis Baratheon sent no direct reply, but the spymaster reported that ships were preparing to leave Dragonstone. Renly was rumored to be in the Reach, courting the support of Mace Tyrell. The North was silent, its new warden, Robb Stark, apparently facing trouble with the Greyjoys. The Tullus of Riverrun vacillated. The Martells of Dorne had scores to settle with the Lannisters, but that did not mean they would accept a bastard's rule. The entire realm was a powder keg, and Gendry sat in its center. He tried to do right by the small folk. He visited the city's markets, guarded by a heavy retinue, to see the plight of the commoners. He ordered that bread be distributed from the royal granaries at a fair price, hoping to curb immediate hunger. He allowed the faith of the Seven to resume charitable works. He even tried to speak to guild leaders, drawing on his own experiences as a blacksmith's apprentice. In some corners, this earned him a measure of goodwill. People whispered that Gendry was a different kind of king, that he cared about the poor because he had been poor himself. But good intentions did not fill every belly. Without an influx of grain from the Reach or the Riverlands, King's Landing's food stocks would not last indefinitely. He found an unlikely ally in Ser Barristan Selmy. The old knight had mourned Robert's death deeply and had been outraged by the Lannisters' manipulations. Initially, Barristan had vanished from the city, but upon hearing rumors that a bastard son of Robert had seized the throne, he returned in secret to see if it was true. When he laid eyes upon Gendry for the first time, the old knight's eyes brimmed with a mix of sorrow and wonder, for in Gendry he could see the image of the young Robert, the man Barristan had once followed into battle. After testing Gendry's sincerity, Barristan bent the knee and offered his sword to protect the new king. Gendry, awed to have such a legendary Kingsguard at his side, named Ser Barristan his Lord Commander. Having Barristan Selmy on the Kingsguard lent Gendry a certain legitimacy. Men remembered the old knight's honor, and if Barristan served Gendry, perhaps the new king was more than just an upstart bastard. But other problems loomed. Tywin Lannister began to muster an army, and so Gendry's Stormlords prepared for the possibility of open war. The Gold Cloaks were reorganized under men Gendry trusted, at least as far as he could trust anyone, but funding them was difficult. Peter Baelish, the master of coin, smirked as he pointed out that war required gold, and Gendry had no obvious treasury to tap beyond what Robert had left, which was not substantial, given the debts owed to the Iron Bank of Bravos and others. The city's coffers were meager compared to the enormous cost of feeding an army and a capital. Each day, fresh challenges confronted Gendry, and each day he felt more like he was standing beneath a falling hammer. He was haunted by the question of what had happened to Ned Stark. Rumors persisted that the Hand of the King had been taken prisoner by Cersei before the coup, possibly languishing in a dungeon somewhere within the Red Keep. Gendry ordered a search, but they found no sign of Stark. Interrogating Lannister loyalists yielded conflicting stories. Some said Stark had been locked in the Black Cells. Others claimed he escaped. Gendry was left with uncertainty, though he prayed the man still lived. If Ned Stark was at large, perhaps he could bring the North to Gendry's side. If the man were imprisoned, perhaps a rescue might avert war. But the truth remained elusive. Some nights, Gendry dreamed he heard the clang of a smith's hammer echoing through the dark halls, calling him to return to a simpler life. He dreamed of his mother, though he could barely remember her face, and he dreamed of King Robert, a hulking figure with a booming laugh who was both father and stranger. Then he'd awaken, drenched in sweat, in the king's bedchamber, attendants fussing about him, and realize there was no turning back. It was about a fortnight after Gendry's seizure of King's Landing that Stannis Baratheon finally moved. Ships flying the crowned stag of Dragonstone appeared off the coast near Blackwater Bay, blockading the harbor. In the early morning light, Gendry stood atop the castle walls with Barristan Selmy and Ser Jon Penrose, gazing out at the sea. Great war galleys rocked on the waves, and small landing craft approached the shore. They bore the sigil of House Baratheon as well, but a different branch Stannis's rigid, unyielding style. Here was the elder brother who might feel rightful claim to the throne. Gendry swallowed. Ser Barristan advised caution, for Stannis was not a man who yielded easily. Gendry's heart pounded. Would Stannis attack? Would he negotiate? Was Gendry prepared to face the man many believed the true heir by law, as Robert's legitimate brother? Later that day, a raven arrived, bearing a message from Stannis himself. The parchment, written in a firm, unadorned script, addressed Gendry as the bastard who styles himself king. Stannis demanded Gendry's immediate abdication. He claimed that Robert's crown lawfully passed to him, Stannis, by right of being the eldest surviving Baratheon brother. He made no mention of the rumor that Cersei's children were bastards born of incest, yet it was clear that he regarded Gendry as a usurper. He gave Gendry 3 days to relinquish the Iron Throne, release Cersei and Joffrey for trial, and open the city gates to Stannis's men. If Gendry did not comply, Stannis threatened to assault King's Landing with fire and sword, as the Lord of Dragonstone is the rightful king. Gendry summoned his council. Ser Barristan, Ser Jon Penrose, Lord Caron, Varys, Littlefinger, and a handful of others gathered in the small council chamber. Discussion erupted in heated waves. Some believed they should fight, claiming the city's walls could hold against a naval blockade, while Stormland reinforcements arrived from the southeast. Others believed Gendry should try to treat with Stannis, hoping to find some arrangement of power sharing or a compromise. Gendry listened, head throbbing, uncertain. He had no personal animosity towards Stannis, but he knew that bending the knee meant giving up everything he'd fought for, everything his men had died for. Ser Jon insisted that many Stormlords despised Stannis's cold demeanor and had chosen Gendry for that very reason. A fight seemed inevitable. Barristan calmly pointed out that civil war between two Baratheons would be a tragedy. Varys said nothing, letting the others talk. Littlefinger simply observed that no matter which side prevailed, the city would bleed. At last Gendry spoke. In a halting voice, he said he would not surrender the throne he had seized for House Baratheon. He would not yield to Stannis's ultimatum. However, he did not wish for bloodshed if it could be avoided. He decided to offer Stannis a parley under the banner of true. The council debated the wisdom of this, but in the end, they agreed it was the least disastrous course. Gendry's instincts told him to face Stannis man to man, to look into the eyes of his uncle, if only to see for himself whether an accord could be reached. The next day, a boat bearing Gendry, Barristan Selmy, and a small retinue of Stormland knights ventured out under a white flag. They met Stannis's longboat halfway between the city's docks and the blockade. Stannis himself sat rigidly in the prow, flanked by men with grim expressions. When the two boats drew alongside each other, Barristan and Stannis exchanged curt nods, for the old knight had once served him as well, albeit indirectly. Gendry saw the hardness in Stannis's eyes, the set of his jaw, the grim line of his mouth. This was not a man who bent easily. Gendry felt a flicker of fear, but forced himself to stand tall in the rocking boat, crown upon his head. They spoke for a time, their voices carrying over the waves. Gendry explained how he had come to claim King's Landing, how the Stormlords believed Robert's blood should not be supplanted by Lannister cunning. Stannis listened but was not impressed. He said the truth was the truth. He was Robert's lawful heir, and Gendry was born on the wrong side of the sheets, with no legitimate claim. He told Gendry that if he yielded the throne, he would be spared, perhaps given some courtesy as a recognized bastard. He might be installed as lord of some minor keep in the Stormlands. But if Gendry refused, Stannis promised that the city would burn. Gendry might be Robert's seed, but that did not make him a lawful king. Gendry's face grew hot. For a moment, he wrestled with anger, wanting to shout that Robert had chosen him, that the people of the Stormlands had chosen him, that King's Landing had accepted him. But Stannis's unwavering stare reminded him that not all men weigh legitimacy by popular acceptance. Some weighed it by law and by unbending principle. Gendry tried to propose a compromise, that Stannis serve as his hand, that they rule together, that the combined might of the Stormlands unite behind the Baratheon name. But Stannis's lips curled in distaste. He scoffed at the notion, repeating that Gendry was a bastard, that his kingship was a travesty and would end in calamity. Barristan Selmy tried to intervene, suggesting that they seek a path of peace for Robert's sake, but Stannis remained unmoved. His only offer of compromise was that Gendry step aside entirely, that King's Landing open its gates to him, and that he would allow Gendry to live out his days quietly, so long as he caused no further trouble. Gendry knew he could never accept that. He thought of the knights who had died for him, the small folk who believed in him, the men who had risked everything to bring him here. He would betray them all if he bent the knee now. Summoning his courage, Gendry declared that he would not yield. He swore he would defend King's Landing against any who tried to wrest it away, in Robert's name. Stannis only stared with a cold, resigned finality. No further words could bridge the gulf between them. The parley ended. Gendry and his men returned to the city, hearts heavy, aware that a siege was coming. Stannis wasted little time. The blockade tightened, cutting off supply ships carrying food and resources. Within days, King's Landing felt the pinch. Bread lines grew longer. Tensions rose. Some wondered if Gendry had made a mistake, if a bastard could truly stand against Stannis Baratheon, who had commanded fleets and armies. But Gendry's Stormlords remained fiercely loyal, resolved to hold the city or die trying. While the city braced for siege, Gendry worked day and night. He visited the city's armories, ordering weapons forged in large quantities. The blacksmiths were startled when the king himself, once an apprentice like them, offered suggestions on hammering technique, how to better shape the breastplates. Some felt a stirring of pride to have such a king, while others worried it was a sign of desperation. Word reached Gendry that Tywin Lannister's forces were still massing in the west, possibly preparing to march. Two threats loomed. If Tywin allied with Stannis, Gendry would be caught in a vice. Meanwhile, no word had come from Renly. Rumors circulated that he was raising an army with the Tyrells, planning to strike at the capital from the south. The newly minted King Gendry found himself surrounded by enemies on all sides. Amid this turmoil, a flicker of hope arrived. A raven from the north, carrying Lord Robb Stark's seal. The young wolf wrote that he had learned of Gendry's coup, that he had heard rumors of Ned Stark's disappearance, and that the North would not recognize Joffrey as king due to the suspicion that he was Jaime Lannister's get. Robb Stark did not outright declare for Gendry, but he proposed a treaty of neutrality, suggesting that if Gendry would help locate Ned Stark and pledge to honor the North's autonomy, the Starks might be persuaded to align with him. This was the best news Gendry had received in weeks. Though it was not a full alliance, it was an overture. Eager to secure any advantage, Gendry wrote back in the friendliest terms he could muster, promising to do all in his power to find Ned Stark and to treat with the North as equals. That same day, Gendry personally descended into the dungeon cells that his men had swept after the coup. With torches in hand, accompanied by Barristan Selmy, he searched every corridor and cell, hoping to find some hint of Ned Stark. Alas, they found no living trace of him. A few half-mad prisoners babbled about a lord with gray eyes being taken away by the Lannisters, but no one knew where. It seemed Cersei might have spirited him off before she lost the city. The revelation left Gendry feeling hollow. He had promised to help Ned, but Ned might be dead. He steeled himself, resolved to try other avenues. Perhaps the spider Varys might know more, but Varys, elusive as ever, claimed ignorance. Gendry doubted him, but he had no proof. When Gendry returned from the dungeons, he found that Cersei had demanded an audience. She had requested to speak with him privately, though the guards would never allow her to be alone with him. Curiosity and a sense of duty compelled him to agree, so he had her brought to a small chamber, shackled, guarded by 4 knights. There, Gendry confronted the woman who had once been queen. She met him with that same sneer of contempt. Though her hair hung in tangled locks, her once fine gown torn and stained. Even in her disheveled state, there was a feral pride in her. She asked Gendry if he enjoyed lording over a city he had stolen. Gendry retorted that it was no more stolen than Robert had taken it from the Mad King. She gave a harsh laugh, pointing out that Robert had Targaryen blood in his line, so at least his claim was distantly linked to the Iron Throne, whereas Gendry was just a bastard who happened to share Robert's lusty appetite for whores. She spat the word at him as though it tasted of bile. Gendry felt anger flare, but he controlled it, simply stating that the realm accepted him as king. Cersei's lips curled, and in a sudden shift of tone, she proposed a bargain. Release her, let her and Joffrey escape to Casterly Rock, and she would ensure that Tywin did not march on King's Landing. She claimed that she could call off her father, that Lannisters always paid their debts. Gendry, though still new to the game, recognized her desperation. He shook his head, refusing. He could not release the queen who had tried to kill him, who had lied about Joffrey's parentage, who might well be responsible for Robert's death. He said justice must come. She sneered at the notion, calling him a naive boy. Then she went for his heart. She told him he was just like his father, Robert, who had never truly known how to rule. She said Robert had been a drunken fool, and that Gendry would soon prove equally incompetent, letting the city starve and the realm collapse into war. Eventually, he'd be cast off the throne by a stronger hand, Stannis, Renly, or Tywin, and left rotting in a dungeon, just as he'd consigned Joffrey and her. Her words stung, but Gendry forced himself not to waver. He ordered the guards to take her away. She spat curses at him until the door slammed shut behind her. He left the chamber shaken but resolute. He had to hold the city, stave off famine, and survive Stannis' siege, or Cersei's prophecy might come true. The days blurred into nights as the blockade tightened, and the winter storms crept closer from the north. The city slowly bled, and still the question of war loomed large. Finally, Stannis' patience ran out. Word reached Gendry's ears that Stannis intended to sail up the Blackwater Rush at night, staging a landing in the slums and attacking the city's weakest gate. Alarm spread through the Stormlords. Gendry ordered every man who could bear arms to the walls, with catapults and pots of wildfire at the ready, a strategy once used by Tyrion Lannister in a timeline Gendry could not have known. But where Tyrion had used cunning, Gendry relied on the experience of older knights who had served with Robert. He prayed it would be enough. The night of the assault came, pitch black except for torches flickering along the walls. The sky was moonless, the water below eerily calm. Gendry stood atop the battlements, clad in heavy armor. His hammer hung at his side, newly forged, more like a king's warhammer than a simple blacksmith's tool. Barristan Selmy was at his right. Ser John Penrose was at his left. Below, the bay was a mass of shadows, but faint silhouettes indicated ships approaching, silent as ghosts. Gendry could almost imagine he heard Stannis' voice in the wind, commanding his men forward. Then the signal was given. From Stannis' ships, flaming arrows arced upward, a quiet glimmer in the darkness, landing with small bursts of fire among the shoreline. Siege ladders and rafts emerged from the gloom. A wave of soldiers began wading ashore under the cover of darkness. The watchers on the walls shouted an alarm. Stormlords, archers, and city watchmen sprang into action, loosing arrows into the night. The hiss and whistle of shafts was followed by the dull thud of bodies falling into the shallows. Stannis' men were disciplined, pressing forward despite casualties. Ladder after ladder rose against the city walls, and grappling hooks latched onto the battlements. Gendry peered down to see a tide of helmets and shields, surging forward like an unstoppable tide. Fear seized him, but he swallowed it. He had seized this throne. Now he must defend it. With a nod to Barristan, Gendry signaled for the wildfire. Several great pots were heaved over the walls, shattering upon impact, releasing emerald flames that leaped hungrily across the siege lines. Screams rang out as men were consumed in the eerie green fire. The stench of burning flesh filled the air, and the water itself seemed to catch alight where the wildfire spread in patches. Yet Stannis' men pushed on. Fighting erupted on top of the walls. Gendry flung himself into the fray, hammer swinging. The clash of steel, the roar of flames, the screams of dying men. This was a horror beyond anything Gendry had imagined. But he fought, every muscle taut, guided by instincts honed at the forge. He remembered how steel was shaped, by unyielding blows, so he became unyielding, driving back the attackers with powerful strikes. Men fell from the battlements, shrieking into the fires below. At one point, Gendry nearly lost his balance as a mailed soldier grappled him. The weight threatened to drag him over the wall. But Barristan's sword intervened, cutting the attacker down. Gendry caught his breath, nodded thanks. He pressed on, forging a path to rally his men. They recognized him even in the darkness, calling his name, calling him King Gendry. Their voices were tinged with desperation, but also hope that their king was fighting beside them, not cowering in a tower. Yet Stannis's men gained a foothold where the walls were least defended near the mud gate. A group of them stormed inside, opening a sally port to let more in. Soon, the battle spilled into the streets. Gendry's forces scrambled to contain them. Fire lit the night in flickering pockets. Houses and shops began to burn as fighting raged. The city moaned with chaos. Gendry rushed to the streets, his knights forming a wedge around him, to push back the intruders. The clash was brutal. The fighting turned into a series of skirmishes around corners, through alleys, over piles of rubble. Citizens shrieked, fleeing their homes. Gendry, seeing the city he'd sworn to protect ablaze, felt a surge of rage. He threw himself at the invaders, hammer rising and falling, driving them back by sheer force and fury. He roared Robert's name, as if summoning the spirit of his father. Gradually, the Stormlords sealed off the breach, forcing the invaders to retreat or be cut down. By dawn, the city still stood, battered but not broken. The stench of smoke and blood was everywhere. Stannis did not relent easily. Another wave came that next night, aimed at a different gate. Then another assault. Each time, Gendry's men repulsed them with wildfire and steel, but the toll was heavy. Hundreds lay dead on both sides. The city reeled. Food grew scarcer. If Stannis kept up the assaults, or if the blockade strangled the city further, Gendry knew they might not last. But to surrender meant giving up all they had fought for, everything that had cost so much blood. In the midst of this siege, an unexpected raven arrived from the west. Tywin Lannister had come to an arrangement with Renly Baratheon. In exchange for granting the Tyrells wide autonomy and certain spoils, Tywin had apparently enticed Renly to press his own claim on the throne, combining Tyrell might and Lannister cunning. They aimed to crush both Gendry and Stannis, ensuring the realm was secured for Renly, a Baratheon in name, beloved by the people, but also controlled by the powerful houses that propped him up. Rumor said they marched from the Reach and would soon converge on King's Landing as well. Thus Gendry found himself besieged by one uncle from the sea and threatened by another uncle from the land. The irony gnawed at him, but the Stormlords did not break. Their pride would not allow it. So day after day the siege dragged on. King's Landing coughed up more dead. The small folk began cursing Gendry's name or cursing Stannis's or both. Many just prayed for any outcome that would end the suffering. On the 7th day of the siege, a rumor spread through the city like wildfire. Men had spotted a banner flying over the horizon to the north, the dire wolf of House Stark. Whispers claimed that Robb Stark marched south to break the blockade, not for Gendry's sake, but to liberate his father if Ned Stark was still alive, or to avenge him if he was not. Some said the North had allied with the Riverlands to strike a blow at Lannister power, and if Gendry was the lesser evil, so be it. Hope stirred in the battered city. If Robb Stark attacked from the north, Stannis might be forced to lift the blockade and face a new threat. Gendry could hold out a little longer, though the city was on the brink of starvation and revolt. He ordered every scrap of food rationed, every soldier kept ready. In the thick of night, Gendry lay awake, hearing the distant cries of men on the walls, the crackle of flames, the sobs of the starving. He wondered if Robert was looking down on him in approval or shaking his head at the ruin. Gendry clenched his fists, remembering how quickly this had all come about, how he'd been a simple blacksmith's apprentice days before Robert died. Could he hold this throne long enough to make it worth all the blood spilled? Yet even in this darkest hour, Gendry dared to dream of a realm at peace. He could picture, dimly, a time when the fighting ended, when he could be a king who was not a usurper or an oppressor, but a champion for the very people he'd grown up among. The storm clouds massed around him, unrelenting, but in his mind's eye, he still saw the forge, still heard the ringing of steel. If life was a forge, then kingship was the steel, malleable under the hammer, shaped by each blow. If he could endure the heat, if he could withstand the hammer strikes of fate, perhaps he might emerge tempered, ready to stand as King Gendry Baratheon, a king for the common folk and the nobility alike. He felt the final sparks of hope flaring inside him, small but bright. Somewhere out there, Ned Stark might still live. Perhaps the North truly approached. Perhaps Renly's alliance with the Lannisters would fracture under mutual distrust. Perhaps Stannis would tire. Perhaps the realm would see that Gendry's claim, while born in bastardy, was forged in the fires of justice, if justice still had any meaning in Westeros. Morning came, thin and pale over the battered city. Gendry rose, donned his armor, took up his hammer, and prepared to do it all again. Siege or no siege, he was the king now, and he would see it through for better or worse. So began the next chapter of turmoil in the Seven Kingdoms, a civil war of Baratheons with Gendry at its center, determined not to fail the legacy he had never asked to inherit, yet found himself shouldering all the same. And as the city walls trembled with the thunder of renewed assault, Gendry's voice echoed back to his men, unwavering. For he might be a bastard, but he was a Baratheon bastard, and storms were in his blood. If he was destined to rule, he would do so with the strength of the forge that had shaped him, and he would hold fast, hammer in hand, until the realm acknowledged him or death claimed him.